On this video, I'm going to continue on reading from WaldoEmerson's essays, and we are currently on page 490. Please leave your thoughts, your comments, your feedback. It'll be much appreciated. I'm going to carry on. This hard-headed humorist whose strange conceits, drollery, and bonhomie diverted the young patricians, while the rumor of his sayings and quibbles gets abroad every day, turns out, in the sequel, to have a probity as invincible as his logic, and to be either insane or at least under cover of this play, enthusiastic in his religion. When accused before the judges of subverting the popular creed, he affirms the immortality of the soul, the future reward and punishment, and refusing to recant in a caprice of the popular government, was condemned to die and sent to the prison. Socrates entered the prison and took away all ignominy from the place, which could not be a prison whilst he was there. Crito bribed the jailer, but Socrates would not go out by treachery. Quote, "Whatever inconvenience ensue, nothing is to be preferred before justice. These things I hear like pipes and drums, whose sound makes me deaf to everything you say." End quote. The fame of this prison, the fame of the discourses there, and the drinking of the hemlock are one of the most precious passages in the history of the world. The rare coincidence is one ugly body of the droll and the martyr, the King Street and market debater, with the sweetest saint known to any history at that time, had forcibly struck the mind of Plato. So capacious of these contrasts, and the figure of Socrates a necessity placed itself in the foreground of the scene. As the fittest dispenser of the intellectual treasures he had to communicate, it was a rare fortune that this Aesop of the mob and this robbed scholar should meet, to make each other immortal in their mutual faculty. The strange synthesis in the character of Socrates capped the synthesis in the mind of Plato. Moreover, by this means he was able, in the direct and without envy, to avail himself of the wit and weight of Socrates, to which unquestionably his own debt was great. And these derived again their principal advantage from the perfect art of Plato. It remains to say that the defect of Plato in power is only that which results inevitably from his quality. He is intellectual in his aim, and therefore in expression literary. Mounting into heaven, diving into the pit, expounding the laws of the state, the passion of love, the remorse of crime, the hope of the parting soul. He's literary, and never otherwise. It is almost a sole deduction from the merit of Plato that his writings have not, what is no doubt incident to this regnancy of intellect in his work, the vital authority which the screams of prophets and the sermons of unlettered Arabs and Jews possess. There is an interval into cohesion. Contact is necessary. I know not what can be said in reply to this criticism, but that we have come to a fact in the nature of things. An oak is not an orange. The qualities of sugar remain with sugar, and those of salt with salt. In the second place, he has not a system. The dearest defenders and disciples are at fault. He attempted a theory of the universe, and his theory is not complete or self-evident. One man thinks he means this, and another that. He has said one thing in one place, and the reverse of it in another place. He is charged with having failed to make the transition from ideas to matter. Here is the world, sound as a nut, perfect, not the smallest piece of chaos left, never a stitch nor an end but a mark of haste or batching or second thought. But the theory of the world is a thing of shreds and patches. The longest wave is quickly lost in the sea. Plato would willingly have Platonism, a known and accurate expression for the world, and it should be accurate. It shall be the world passed through the mind of Plato, nothing less. Every atom shall have the Platonic tinge. Every atom, every relation, or quality you knew before, you shall know again and find here, but now ordered, not nature, but art. And you shall feel that Alexander indeed overran with men and horses some countries of the planet, but countries and things of which countries are made, elements, planet itself, laws of planet and of men, have passed through this man as bread into his body, and become no longer bread but body. So all this mammoth morsel has become Plato. He has clapped copyright on the world. This is the ambition of individualism, but the mouthful proves too large. Boa constrictor has good will to eat it, but he is foiled. He falls abroad in the attempt, and biting gets strangled. The bitten world holds the bitter fast by his own teeth. There he perishes, unconquered. Nature lives on and forgets him. So it fears it all, so must it fear with Plato. In view of eternal nature, Plato turns out to be philosophical excitations. He argued on his side and on that. The acutest German, the lovingest disciple, could never tell what Platonism was. Indeed, admirable texts can be quoted on both sides of every great question from him. These things we are forced to say if we must consider the effort of Plato or of any philosopher to dispose of nature which will not be disposed of. No power of genius has ever yet had the smallest success in explaining existence. The perfect enigma remains, but there is an injustice in assuming this ambition for Plato. Let us not seem to treat with flippancy his venerable name. Men in proportion to their intellect have admitted his transcendent claims. The way to know him is to compare him not with nature, but with other men. How many ages have gone by and he remains unapproached? A chief structure of human wit, like Karnak or the medieval cathedrals, or the Etrurian remains. It requires all the breadth of human faculty to know it. I think it is truliest seen when seen with the most respect. His sense deepens, his merits multiply with study. When we say here is a fine collection of fables, or when we praise his style or common sense or arithmetic, we speak as boys, and much of our impatient criticism of the dialectic, I suspect, is no better. The criticism is like our impatience of miles. When we are in a hurry, but it is still best that a mile should have 1,760 yards. The great eye Plato proportioned the lights and shades after the genius of our life. Plato knew readings. The publication in Mr. Bowen's Serial Library, of the excellent translations of Plato, which we esteem one of the chief benefits the cheap press has yielded, gives us an occasion to take hastily a few more notes of the elevation and bearings of this fixed star, or to add a bulletin like the journals of Plato at the latest dates. Modern science, by the extent of its generalization, has learned to identify the students of man for the defects of individuals by tracing growth and ascent in races, and by the simple expedient of lighting up the vast background generates a feeling of complacency and hope. The human being has a saurian, and the plant in his rear. His arts and science, the easy issue of his brain, look glorious when prospectively beheld from the distant brain of ox, crocodile, and fish. It seems as if nature, in regarding the geologic night behind him, when in 5 or 6 millenniums she has turned out 5 or 6 men, as Homer Phidias, Meno, and Columbus, was no wise discontent with the result. These samples attested the virtue of the tree. There was a clear amelioration of trilobite and sorus, and a good basis for further proceeding. With this artist, time and space are cheap, and she is insensible to what you say of tedious preparation. She waited tranquilly the flowing periods of paleontology, for the hour to be struck when man should arrive. Then periods must pass before the motion of the earth can be suspected, then before the map of the instincts and the cultival power can be drawn. But as of races, so the succession of individual men is fatal and beautiful, and Plato has the fortunate history of mankind to mark an epoch. Plato's frame does not stand on syllogism or on any masterpieces of Socratic reasoning, or any thesis, as for example the immortality of the soul. He is more than an expert or a schoolman or a geometer, or the prophet of a peculiar message. He represents the privilege of the intellective power, namely of carrying up every fact to successive platforms, and so disclosing in every fact a germ of expansion. These expansions are in the essence of thought. The naturalists would never help us to them by any discoveries of the extent of the universe, but is as poor when cataloguing the resolved nebula of Orion as when measuring the angels of an acre. But the Republic of Plato, by these expansions, may be said to require and so to anticipate the astronomy of a place. The expansions are organic. The mind does not create what it perceives, any more than the eye creates the rose. In ascribing to Plato the merit of announcing them, we only say, here is a more complete man who could apply to nature the whole scale of the senses, the understanding and the reason. These expansions or extensions consist in continuing the spiritual sight where the horizon falls on our natural vision, and by the second sight discovering the long lines of law which shoot in every direction. Everywhere he stands on a path which has no end, but runs continuously round the universe. Therefore, everywhere becomes an exponent of nature. Whatever he looks upon discloses a second sense and ulterior senses. His perception of the generation of contrary of death out of life and life out of death. His perception of the generation of contraries of death out of life and life out of death, that law by which in nature decomposition is recomposition, and putrefaction and cholera are only signals of new creation. His discerning of the little in the large, and the large in the small, studying the state in the citizen and the citizen in the state, leaving it doubtful whether he exhibited the republic as an allegory or the education of the private soul. His beautiful definitions of ideas of times, of form, of figure, of the lines and limbs, hypothetically given as the defining of virtues, apologues themselves, the cave of Trophonius, the ring of Gyges, the charioteer and 2 horses, the gold and silver, brass and iron temperaments, Theath and Thamos, and the visions of Hades and Thetis, fables which have imprinted themselves in human memory like the sign of the zodiac. His soliform eye and his buniform soul, his doctrine of assimilation, his doctrine of reminiscence, his clear vision of the laws of return or reaction which secure instant justice throughout the universe, instanced everywhere, but especially in the doctrine. What comes from God to us returns from God to us. And in Socrates' belief that the laws below are sisters of the law above. More striking examples are his moral conclusions. Plato confirms the coincidence of science and virtue, for vice can never know itself and virtue, but virtue knows both itself and vice. The eye attested that justice was best, as long as it was profitable. Plato affirms that it is profitable throughout, that the profit is intrinsic through the just, though the just conceal his justice from gods and men, that it is better to suffer injustice than to do it, that the sinner ought to covet punishment, that the lie was more hurtful than homicide, and that ignorance or the involuntary lie was more calamitous than involuntary homicide, that the soul is unwillingly deprived of true opinions, and that no man sits willingly, that the order or proceeding of nature was from the mind to the body, that though a sound body cannot restore an unsound mind, yet a good soul can, by its virtue, render the body the best possible. The intelligent have a right over the ignorant, namely the right of instructing them. The right punishment of one out of tune is to make him play in tune. The fine which the good, refusing to govern, ought to pay, is to be governed by a worse man. That his God shall not handle gold and silver, but shall be instructed that there is gold and silver in their souls, which will make men willing to give him everything which they need. Let me repeat that. His God shall not handle gold and silver, but shall be instructed that there is gold and silver in their souls, which will make men willing to give them everything which they need. The second side explains the stress laid on geometry. He saw that the globe of Earth was not more lawful and precise than was the supersensible. That is, that a celestial geometry was in place there as a logic of lines and angles here below. That the world was throughout mathematical. The proportions are constant of oxygen, azote, and lime. There is just so much water and slate and magnesia, not less of the proportions constant of the moral elements. The eldest Goth, hating varnish and falsehood, delighted in revealing the real at the base of the accidental, in discovering connection, continuity and representation everywhere, hating insulation, and appears like the god of wealth among the cabins of vagabonds, opening power and capability in everything he touches. Ethical science was new and vacant when Plato could write thus, quote, "Of all whose arguments are left to the man of the present time, no one has ever yet condemned injustice or praised justice, otherwise than as respects the repute, honors, and emoluments arising therefrom, while as respects either of them in itself, and subsisting by its own power in the soul of the possessor, and concealed both from gods and men, no one has yet sufficiently investigated, either in poetry or prose writings, how, namely, that injustice is the greatest of all the evils that the soul has within it, and justice the greatest good." End quote. His definition of ideas as what is simple, permanent, uniform, and self-existent, forever discriminating them from the notions of the understanding, marks an era in the world. He was born to behold the self-evolving power of spirit, endless generator of new ends, a power which is the key at once to the centrality, and the evanescence of things. Plato is so centered that he can well spare all his dogmas. Thus, the fact of knowledge and ideas reveals to him the fact of eternity, and the doctrine of reminiscence he offers as the most probable particular explication. Call the fanciful, it matters not. The connection between our knowledge and the best of being is still real, and the explication must be not less magnificent. He has indicated every eminent point in speculation. He wrote on the scale of the mind itself, so that all things have symmetry in his tablet. He put in all the past without weariness, and descended into detail with a courage like that he witnessed in nature. One would say that his forerunners had mapped out each a form of or a distinct or an island in intellectual geography, but that Plato first drew the sphere. He domesticates the soul in nature. Man is the microcosm. All the circles of the visible have to represent as many circles in the rational soul. There is no lawless particle, and there is nothing casual in the action of the human mind. The names of things, too, are fatal, following the nature of things. All the gods of the pantheon are, by their name, significant of a profound sense. The gods are the ideas. Pan is speech or manifestation. Saturn, the contemplative. Jove, the regal soul, and Mars, passion. Venus is proportion. Calliope, the soul of the world. Aglaia, intellectual illustration. These thoughts in sparkles of light had appeared often to pious and to poetic souls. But this well-bred, all-knowing Greek geometer comes with command, gathers them all up into ranks and gradation. The Euclid of holiness and Marines, the two parts of nature before all men, he saw the intellectual values of the moral sentiment. He described his own ideal when he paints in Timaeus, a god leading things from disorder into order. He kindled a fire so truly in the center that we see the sphere illuminated and can distinguish poles. Equator and lines of latitude. Every arc and node a theory so average, so modulated that you would say the winds of ages had swept through this rhythmic structure. And not that it was a brief extempore, blotting of one short-lived scribe. Hence it has happened that a very well-marked class of souls, namely those who delight in giving a spiritual, that is, an ethico-intellectual expression to every truth, by exhibiting an ulterior and which is yet legitimate to it, are said to Platonize thus. Michelangelo is a Platonist. In his sonnets, Shakespeare is a Platonist when he writes. Quote, nature is made better by no mean, but nature makes that mean. End quote. Let me repeat that again. Quote, nature is made better by no mean, but nature makes that mean. End quote. Or, quote, he that can endure to follow with allegiance a fallen lord does conquer him. That did his master conquer, and earns a place in the story. End quote. Hamlet is a pure Platonist, and it is the magnitude only of Shakespeare's proper genius that hinders him from being classed as the most eminent of the school. Swedenborg, throughout his prose poem of, quote, conjugal love, end quote, is a Platonist. His subtlety commended him to men of thought. The secret of his popular success is the moral aim which endeared him to mankind. Quote, intellect, end quote, he said, quote, is king of heaven and earth, end quote. But in Plato, intellect is always moral. His writings have also the sempiternal youth of poetry, for their arguments, most of them, might have been couched in sonnets, and poetry has never soared higher than in the Timaeus and the Phaedrus. As the poet too, he is only contemplative. He did not, like Pythagoras, break himself with an institution. All his painting in the Republic must be esteemed mythical, with intent to bring out, sometimes in violent colors, his thoughts. You cannot institute without peril of charlatanism. It was a high scheme, his absolute privilege for the best, parentheses, which to make emphatic he expressed by community of women, and parentheses, as the premium which he could set on grandeur. There shall be exempts of two kinds. First, those who by demerit have put themselves below protection, outlaws. And secondly, those who by eminence of nature and desert are out of the reach of your rewards. Let us be free of the city and above the law. We confine them to themselves. Let them do with us they will. Let them do with us as they will. Let none presume to measure the irregularities of Michelangelo and Socrates by village scales. In his 8th book, The Republic, he throws a little mathematical dust in our eyes. I'm sorry to see him, after such noble superiorities, permitting the lie to governors. Plato plays Providence a little with the baser sort, as people allow themselves with their dogs and cats. That was page 498. I believe this book is now finished. Now on to the next book. We are here on page 499. Napoleon, or the Man of the World. Among the eminent persons of the 19th century, Bonaparte is far the best known and the most powerful, and owes his predominance to the fidelity with which he expresses the tone of thought and belief, the aims of the masses of active and cultivated men. It is Swedenborg's theory that every organ is made up of homogeneous particles, or as it is sometimes expressed, every whole is made of similars. That is, the lungs are composed of infinitely small lungs, the liver of infinitely small livers, the kidney of little kidneys, etc. Following this analogy, if any man is found to carry with him the power of affections of vast numbers, if Napoleon is France, if Napoleon is Europe, it is because these people whom he sways are little Napoleons. In our society, there is a standing antagonism between the conservative and the democratic classes, between those who have made their fortunes and the young and the poor who have fortunes to make, between the interests and dead labor. That is, the labor of hands long ago still in the grave, which labor is now entombed in money stocks or in land and buildings owned by idle capitalists, and the interest of living labor, which seeks to possess itself of land and buildings and money stocks. First class is timid, selfish, illiberal, hating innovation, and continually losing numbers by death. The second class is selfish also, encroaching, bold, self-relying, always outnumbering the other and recruiting its numbers every hour by bursts. It desires to keep open every avenue of the competition of war, and to multiply avenues, the class of businessmen in America and England, in France, and throughout Europe. The class of industry and skill, Napoleon is representative. The instinct of active, brave, able men throughout the middle class, everywhere, has pointed out Napoleon as the incarnate democrat. He had their virtues and their vices. Above all, he had their spirit or aim. The tendency is material, pointing at a sensual success and employing the richest and most various means to that end. Conversant with mechanical powers, highly intellectual, widely and accurately learned and skillful, but subordinating all intellectual and spiritual forces into means to a material success. To be the rich man is the end. Quote, God has granted, end quote, says the Quran. Quote, to every people a prophet in its own tongue, end quote. Paris and London and New York, the spirit of commerce, of money and material power, were also to have their prophet, and Bonaparte was qualified and sent. Every one of the million readers of the anecdotes or memoirs or lives of Napoleon delights in the page because he studies in it his own history. Napoleon is thoroughly modern, and at the highest point of his fortunes has the very spirit of the newspapers. He is no saint. To use his own words, quote, no Capuchin, end quote. And he is no hero in the highest sense. The man in the street finds in him the qualities and powers of other men in the street. He finds him, like himself, by birth a citizen, who by very intelligible merits arrived at such a commanding position that he could indulge all those tastes which the common man possesses but is obliged to conceal and deny. Good society, good books, fast traveling dress, dinners, servants, or diners, servants without number, personal weight, execution of his ideas, the standing in the attitude of a benefactor to all persons about him, the refined enjoyments of pictures, statues, music, palaces, and conventional honors, precisely what is agreeable to the heart of every man in the 19th century. This powerful man possessed. It is true that a man of Napoleon's truth of adaptation to the mind of the masses around him becomes not merely representative, but actually a monopolizer and usurper of other minds. Thus Mirabeau plagiarized every good thought, every good word that was spoken in France. Dumont relates that he sat in the gallery of the convention and heard Mirabeau make a speech. It struck Dumont that he could fit it with a peroration, which he wrote in pencil immediately, and showed it to Lord Elgin, who sat by him. Lord Elgin approved it, and Dumont, in the evening, showed it to Mirabeau. Mirabeau read it, pronounced it admirable, and declared he would incorporate it into his harangue to tomorrow, to the assembly. Quote, "It is impossible," end quote, said Dumont, quote, "as unfortunately I have shown it to Lord Elgin," end quote. Quote, "If you have shown it to Lord Elgin and to 50 persons beside, I shall still speak it tomorrow," end quote. He did speak it with much effect at the next session, for Mirabeau, with his overpowering personality, felt that these things which his presence inspired were as much his own as if he had said them, and that his adoption of them gave them their weight. Much more absolute and centralizing was its successor to Mirabeau's popularity, and to much more than his predominance in France. Indeed, a man of Napoleon's stamp almost ceaseless to have a private speech and opinion. He is largely receptive. Indeed, a man of Napoleon's stamp almost ceases to have a private speech and opinion. He is so largely receptive and is so placed that he comes to a bureau for all intelligence, wit, and power of the age and country. He gains the battle, he makes the code, he makes the system of weights and measures, he levels the Alps, he builds the road. All distinguished engineers, savants, statistics report to him. So likewise, to all good heads in every kind, he adopts the best measures, sets a stamp on them. And not these alone, but on every happy and memorable expression. Every sentence spoken by Napoleon and every line of his writing deserves reading, as it is the sense of France. Bonaparte was the idol of common men because he had in transcendental degree the qualities and powers of common men. There is a certain satisfaction in coming down to the lowest ground of politics, for we get rid of cant and hypocrisy. Bonaparte wrought in common with that great class he represented for power and wealth. But Bonaparte especially, without any scruple as to the means. All the sentiments which embarrass men's pursuits of these objects he set aside. The sentiment were for women and children. Fontaines in 1804 expressed Napoleon's own sense when on behalf of the Senate he addressed him. "Sire, the desire of perfection is the worst disease that ever afflicted human mind," end quote. Let me repeat that. Quote, "Sire, the desire of perfection is the worst disease that ever afflicted the human mind," end quote. The advocates of liberty and of progress are, quote, ideologists, end quote. A word of contempt often in his mouth. Quote, "Necker is an ideologist," end quote. Quote, "Lafayette is an ideologist," end quote. An Italian proverb too well known declares that, quote, "If you would succeed, you must not be too good," end quote. It is an advantage, within certain limits, to have renounced the dominion of sentiments of piety, gratitude, and generosity, since what was an impossible bar to us, and still is to others, becomes a convenient weapon for our purposes. Just as the river, which was a formidable barrier winter transforms into the smoothest of roads. Napoleon renounced, once for all, sentiment and affections, and will help himself with his hands and his head. With him is no miracle and no magic. He's a worker in brass, in iron, in wood, in earth, in roads, in buildings, in money, and in troops, and a very consistent and wise master workman. He is never weak and literary, but acts with the solidity and the precision of natural agents. He has not lost his native sense and sympathy with things. Men give way before such a man, as before natural events. To be sure, there are men enough who are immersed in things as farmers, smiths, sailors, and mechanics generally, and we know how real and solid such men appear in the presence of scholars and grammarians. But these men ordinarily lack the power of arrangement and are like hands without a head. But Bonaparte superadded to this mineral and animal force, insight and generalization, so that men saw him combined, the natural and intellectual power, as if the sea and land had taken flesh and begun to cipher. Therefore the land and sea seemed to presuppose him. He came into his own and they received him. The ciphering operative knows what he's working with. And what is the product? He knew the properties of gold and iron, of whales and ships, of troops and diplomatists, and required that each should do after its kind. The art of war was the game in which he exerted his arithmetic. It consisted, according to him, in having always more forces than the enemy. On the point where the enemy is attacked, or where he attacks, and his whole talent is strained by endless maneuver and evolution, to march always on the enemy at an angle and destroy his forces in detail. It is obvious that a very small force, skillfully and rapidly maneuvering, so as always to bring two men against one at the point of engagement, will be an overmatch for a much larger body of men. The times, his constitution, and his early circumstances combined to develop this pattern democrat. He had the virtues of his class and the conditions for their activity. That common sense which no sooner respects any end than it finds the means to effect it. The delight in the use of means, in the choice, simplification, and combining of means. The directness and thoroughness of his work. The prudence with which all was seen, and the energy with which all was done, make him the national organ and head of what I may almost call, from its extent, the modern party. The directness and I'm going to read it again in case you didn't see that. The directness and thoroughness of his work, the prudence with which all was seen, and the energy with which all was done, make him the national organ and heads of what I may almost call, from its extent, the modern party. Nature must have far the greatest share in every success, and so in his. Such a man was wanted, and such a man was born. A man of stone and iron, capable of sitting on horseback 16 or 17 hours, of going many days together without rest of food except by snatches, and with the speed and spring of a tiger in action. A man unembarrassed by any scruples, compact, instant, selfish, prudent, and of a perception which did not suffer itself to be balked or misled by any pretenses of others, or any superstition, or any heat or haste of his own. Quote, my hand of iron, end quote. He said, quote, was not at the extremity of my arm. It was immediately connected with my head, end quote. He respected the power of nature and fortune. He ascribed to it his superiority, instead of valuing himself like inferior men on his opinionativeness and waging war with nature. His favorite rhetoric lay in allusion to his star, and he pleased himself as well as the people when he styled himself the child of destiny. Quote, child of destiny, end quote. Quote, they charge me, end quote, he said, with the commission of great crimes. Nothing has been more simple than my elevation. It is in vain to ascribe it to intrigue or crime. It was owing to the peculiarity of the times and to my reputation of having fought well against the enemies of my country. I have always marched with the opinion of great masses and with events. Of what use then would crimes be to me? Again he said, speaking of his son, my son cannot replace me. I cannot replace myself. Again he said, speaking of his son, quote, my son cannot replace me. I cannot replace myself. I am the creature of circumstances. End quote. He had a directness of action never before combined with so much comprehension. He is a realist, terrific to all talkers, and confused truth obscuring persons. He sees where the matter hinges, throws himself to the precise point of resistance and slight of all other considerations. He is strong with the right manner. He is strong in the right manner, namely by insight. He never blundered into victory, but won his battles in his head before he won them on the field. His principal means are in himself. He asks counsel of no other. In 1796, he writes to the Directory, quote, I have conducted the campaign without consulting anyone. I should have done no good if I had been under the necessity of conforming to the notions of another person. I have gained some advantages over superior forces, and when totally destitute of everything, because in the persuasion that your confidence was reposed in me, my actions were as prompt as my thoughts. End quote. History is full, down to this day, of the imbecility of kings and governors. They are a class of persons much to be pitied, for they know not what they should do. The weavers strike for bread, and the king and his ministers, knowing not what to do, meet them with bayonets. But Napoleon understood his business. He was a man who in each moment and emergency knew what to do next. It is an immense comfort and refreshment to the spirits not only of kings but of citizens. Few men have any. Next, they live from hand to mouth without plan and are ever at the end of their line, and after each action wait for an impulse from abroad. Napoleon has been the first man of the world. If his ends had been purely public, as he is, he inspires confidence and vigor by the extraordinary unity of his action. He is firm, sure, self-denying, self-postponing, sacrificing everything, money, troops, generals, and his own safety also, to his aim, not misled, like common adventurers, by the splendor of his own means. Quote, insolence ought not to govern policy, end quote, he said. Quote, but policy incidents, end quote. Quote, to be hurried away by every event is to have no political system at all, end quote. His victories were only so many doors, and he never for a moment lost sight of his way onward in the dazzling uproar of the present circumstances. He knew what to do, and he flew to his mark. He would shorten a straight line to come at his object. Horrible anecdotes may no doubt be collected from his history, or the price at which he bought his success, but he must not therefore be set down as cruel, but only as one who knew no impediment to his will, not bloodthirsty, not cruel, but woe to what thing or person stood in his way. Not bloodthirsty, but not sparing of blood, and pitiless. He saw only the object. The obstacle must give way. Quote, Sire General Clark cannot combine with General Junot for the dreadful fire of the Austrian battery, end quote. Quote, let him carry the battery, end quote. Quote, sire, every regiment that approaches the heavy artillery is sacrifice. Sire, what orders, end quote. Quote, forward, end quote. Serious, sire, a colonel of artillery gives in his quote, military memoirs, end quote, the following sketch of a scene after the Battle of Austerlitz. Quote, at the moment in which the Russian army was making its retreat, painfully but in good order, on the ice of the lake, the Emperor Napoleon came riding at full speed toward the artillery. You are losing time, he cried. Fire upon those masses. They must be engulfed. Fire upon the ice. The order remained unexecuted for 10 minutes. In vain, several officers and myself were placed on the slope of a hill to produce the effect that balls and mine rolled upon the ice without breaking it up. Seeing that I tried a simple method of elevating light howitzers, the almost perpendicular fall of the heavy projectiles produced the desired effect. My method was immediately followed by the adjoining batteries, and in less than no time we buried, end quote, some, quote, thousands of Russians and Austrians under the waters of the lake, end quote. In the plenitude of his resources, every obstacle seemed to vanish. Quote, there shall be no Alps, end quote, he said, and he built his perfect roads, climbing by graded galleries their steepest precipice, until Italy was as open to Paris as any town in France. He laid his bones to and wrought for his crown. Having decided what was to be done, he did that with might and main. He put out all his strength. He risked everything and prepared and spared nothing. Neither ammunition, nor money, nor troops, nor generals, nor himself. We like to see everything to do its office after its kind, whether it be a milk cow or rattlesnake. And if fighting be the best mode of adjusting national differences, as large majorities of men seem to agree, certainly Bonaparte was right. Bonaparte was right in making it through. The grand principle of war, he said, was that an army ought always to be ready, by day and by night, and at all hours to make all the resistance it is capable of making. He never economized his ammunition, but on a hostile position, rained a torrent of iron shells, balls, grape shot to annihilate all defense. At any point of resistance, he concentrated squadron on squadron in overwhelming numbers until it was swept out of existence. To a regiment of horse chasers at Lobenstein, 2 days before the Battle of Jena, Napoleon said, quote, my lads, you must not fear death. When soldiers brave death, they drive him into the enemy's ranks. End quote. In the fury of assault, he no more spared himself. He went to the edge of his possibility. It is plain that in Italy, he did what he could and all that he could. He came several times within an inch of ruin, and his own person was all but lost. He was flung into the marsh of Arcola. The Austrians were between him and his troops and the melee, and he was brought off with desperate efforts. At Lonato and at other places, he was on the point of being taken prisoner. He fought 60 battles. He had never enough. Each victory was a new weapon. Quote, my power would fall were I not to support it by new achievements. Conquest has made me what I am, and conquest must maintain me. End quote. Please forgive me. I don't know if I did that French accent correctly. I don't know. Forgive me, please. He felt with every wise man that as much life is needed for conservation as for creation. We are always in peril, always in a bad plight, just on the edge of destruction, and only to be saved by invention and courage. The vigor was guarded and tempered by the coldest prudence and punctuality. A thunderbolt in the attack. He was found invulnerable in his entrenchments. His very attack was never the inspiration of courage, but the result of calculation. His idea of the best defense consists in being still the attacking party. Quote, my ambition, he says. Let me just repeat that. His very attack was never the inspiration of courage, but the result of calculation. His idea of the best defense consists in being still the attacking party. Quote, my ambition, end quote. He says, quote, was great, but was of a cold nature, end quote. In one of his conversations with Las Cases, he remarked, quote, as to the moral courage, I really met with the 2 o'clock in the morning kind. I mean unprepared courage, that which is necessary on an unexpected occasion, and which, in spite of the most unforeseen events, leaves full freedom of judgment and decision, end quote. And he did not hesitate to declare that he was himself eminently endowed with his 2 o'clock in the morning courage, and that he had met with few persons equal to himself in this respect. Everything depended on the nicety of his combinations, and the stars were not more punctual than in his arithmetic. His personal attention descended to the smallest particulars. Quote, at Montebello, I ordered cavalrymen to attack with 800 horse, and with these he separated the 6,000 Hungarian grenadiers before the very eyes of the Australian cavalry. This cavalry was half a league off, and required a quarter of an hour to arrive on the field of action. And I have observed that it is always these quarters of an hour that decide the fate of the battle. End quote. Quote, before he fought a battle, Bonaparte thought little about what he should do in case of success, but a great deal about what he should do in case of a reverse of fortune. End quote. The same prudence and good sense mark all his behavior. His instructions to his secretary at the Tuileries are worth remembering. Quote, during the night, enter my chamber as seldom as possible. Do not awake me when you have any good news to communicate. With that there is no hurry. But when you bring bad news, rouse me instantly, for then there is not a moment to be lost. End quote. It was a whimsical economy of the same kind which dictated his practice. When general in Italy, in regard to his burdensome correspondence, he directed Buriani to leave all letters unopened for 3 weeks, and then observed with satisfaction how large a part of the correspondence had thus disposed of itself and no longer required an answer. His achievement of business was immense, and enlarges the known powers of men. There have been many working kings, from Ulysses to William of Orange, but none who accomplished a tithe of this man's performance. To these gifts of nature, Napoleon added the advantage of having been born to a private and humble fortune. In his later days, he had the weakness of wishing to add to his crowns and badges the prescription of aristocracy, but he knew his debt to his austere education, and made no secret of his contempt for the born kings, and for, quote, the hereditary asses, end quote, as he coarsely styled the Bourbons. He said that, quote, in their exile, they had learnt nothing and forgot nothing, end quote. Bonaparte had passed through all the degrees of military service, but also was citizen before he was emperor, and so has the key to citizenship. His remarks and estimates discovered the information and justness of measurement of the middle class. Those who had to deal with him found that he was not to be imposed upon, but could cipher as well as another man. This appears in all parts of his memoirs, dictated at St. Helena, when the expenses of the empress, of his household, of his palaces, had accumulated great debts. Napoleon examined the bills of the creditors himself, detected overcharges and errors, and reduced the claims by considerable sums. His grand weapon, namely the millions whom he directed, he owed to the representative character which clothed him. He interests us as he stands for France and for Europe, and he exits as captain and king only as far as the revolution of the interest, as a revolution or the interest of the industrious masses found an organ and a leader in him. Let me read that again. And he exists as captain and king only as far as the revolution or the interest of the industrious masses found an organ and a leader in him. In the social interest, he knew the meaning and value of labor and threw himself naturally on that side. I like an incident mentioned by one of his biographers at St. Helena. Quote, when walking with Mr. Balcom, some servants carrying heavy boxes passed by on the road, and Mrs. Balcom desired them in rather an angry tone to keep back. Napoleon interfered, saying, respect the burden, madame. End quote. In the time of the empire, he directed attention to the improvement and embellishment of the markets of the capital. Quote, the marketplace, end quote, he said, quote, is the lavure of the common people, end quote. The principal works that have survived him are his magnificent roads. He filled the troops with his spirit, and a sort of freedom and companionship grew up between him and them, which the forms of his court never permitted between the officers and himself. They performed under his eye that which no other could do. The best document of his relation to his troops is the order of the day on the morning of the battle of Austerlitz, in which Napoleon promises the troops that he will keep his person out of reach of fire. The declaration, which is the reverse of that ordinarily made by generals and sovereigns on the eve of a battle, sufficiently explains the devotion of the army to their leader. But though there is in particular this identity between Napoleon and the mass of the people, his real strength lay in their conviction that he was their representative in his genius and aims, not only when he courted, but when he controlled, and even when he decimated them by his conscriptions. He knew as well as any Jacobean in France how to philosophize on liberty and equality. And when allusion was made to the precious blood of countries which was spilled by the killing of the Duc d'Enghien, he suggested, quote, neither is my blood ditch water, end quote. The people felt that no longer the throne was occupied and the land sucked of its nourishment by a small class of legitimates, secluded from all community with the children of the soil, and holding ideas and superstitions of a long-forgotten state of society. Instead of that vampire and man of themselves held in the Tuileries, knowledge and ideas like their own, opening of course to them and their children all places of power and trust. The day of sleepy, selfish policy, ever narrowing the means and opportunities of young men, was ended, and a day of expansion and demand was come. A market for all the powers and productions of man was opened. A brilliant prize was opened. Brilliant prizes glittered in the eyes of youth and talent. The old iron-bound feudal France was changed into a young Ohio or New York, and those who smarted under the immediate rigors of the new monarch pardoned them as the necessary severities of the military system which had driven out the oppressor. And even when the majority of the people had begun to ask whether they had really gained anything under the exhausting levies of men and money of the new master, the whole talent of the country, in every rank and kindred, took his part and defended him as his natural patron. In 1814, when he advised to rely on the higher classes, Napoleon said to those around him, quote, gentlemen, in the situation in which I stand, my only nobility is the rabble of the faubourgs, end quote. Napoleon met his natural expectation. The necessity of his position required a hospitality to every sort of talent, and its appointment to trusts, and his feeling went along with this policy. Like every superior person, he undoubtedly felt a desire for men and compeers, and a wish to measure his power with other masses, and an impatience of fools and underlings. In Italy he sought for men and found them. Quote, good God, end quote, he said. Quote, how rare men are. There are 18 millions in Italy, and I have with difficulty found Dandolo and Melzi. End quote. In later years, with larger experiences, respect for mankind was not increased. In a moment of bitterness, he said to one of his oldest friends, quote, men deserve the contempt with which they inspire me. I have only to put some gold lace on the coat of my virtuous republicans, and they immediately become just what I wish them. End quote. The impatience at levity was, however, an oblique tribute of respect to those able persons who commanded his regard, not only when he found them friends and coadjutors, but also when they resisted his will. He could not confound Fox and Pitt, Carnot Lafayette, and Bernadotte with the danglers of his court, and in spite of the detraction with his systemic egotism, dictated toward the great captains who conquered with, and for him, ample acknowledgments unmade by him to Lanas Durok, Kleber Desiax, Massena, Morat, Ney, and Ugaria. If he felt himself their patron and the founder of their fortune, as when he said, quote, I made my generals out of mud, end quote. He could not hide his satisfaction in receiving from them a seconding and support commensurate with the grandeur of his enterprise. In the Russian campaign, he was so much impressed by the courage and resources of Marshal Ney that he said, quote, I have 200 millions in my coffers, and I would give them all for Ney, end quote. The characters which he has drawn of several of his marshals are discriminating, and though they did not content the insatiable vanity of French officers, are no doubt substantially just, and in fact every species of merit was sought and advanced under his government. Quote, I know, end quote, he said, quote, the depth and drought of water of every one of my generals, end quote. Natural power was sure to be well received at his court. 17 men in his time were raised from common soldiers to the rank of king, marshal, duke, or general, and the crosses of his legion of honor were given to personal valor and not to family connection. Quote, when soldiers have been baptized in the fire of a battlefield, they have all one rank in my eyes, end quote. When a natural king becomes a titular king, everybody is pleased and satisfied. The revolution entitled the strong populace of the Faubourg Saint Antoine, and every horseboy and powder monkey in the army, to look on Napoleon as flesh of his flesh and the creature of his party. But there is something in the success of grand talent which enlists an universal sympathy for in the prevalence of sense and spirit, of stupidity and malversation. All reasonable men have an interest, and as intellectual beings we feel we are purified by the electric shocks, or material force is overthrown by intellectual energies. As soon as we are removed out of the reach of local and accidental partialities, man feels that Napoleon fights for him. These are honest victories. The strong steam engine does outwork. Whatever appeals to the imagination by transcending the ordinary limits of human ability wonderfully encourages and liberates us. This capacious head, revolving and disposing sovereignty trains of affairs, and animating such multitudes of agents, this eye which looked through Europe, this prompt invention, the inexhaustible resource. What events, what romantic pictures, what strange situations, when spying the Alps by a sunset in the Sicilian Sea, drawing up his army for battle in sight of the pyramids, and saying to his troops, quote, from the tops of those pyramids 40 centuries look down on you, end quote. Fording the Red Sea, wading the Gulf of the Isthmus of Suez, on the shore of Ptolemais. Gigantic projects agitated him. Quote, had acre fallen, I should have changed the face of the world. End quote. His army on the night of the Battle of Austerlitz, which was the anniversary of his inauguration as emperor, presented him with a bouquet of 40 standards taken in the fight. Perhaps it is a little puerile. Perhaps it is a little puerile, the pleasure he took in making these contrasts glaring, as when he pleased himself with making kings wait in his antechambers at Tilsit, at Paris, and at Erfurt. We cannot, in the universal imbecility, indecision, and indolence of men, sufficiently congratulate ourselves on this strong and ready actor who took occasion by the beard and showed us how much may be accomplished by the mere force of such virtues as all men possess in less degrees, namely by punctuality, by personal attention, by courage and thoroughness. Quote, the Austrians, end quote, he said, quote, do not know the value of time. End quote. I should cite him in his earlier years as a model of prudence. His power does not consist in any wild or extravagant force, in any enthusiasm like Mahomet's, or singular power of persuasion, but in the exercise of common sense under each emergency instead of abiding by rules and customs. The lesson he teaches is that which vigor always teaches, that there is always room for it. To what heaps of cowardly doubts is not man's life an answer? When he appealed, it was the belief of all military men that there could be nothing new in war, as it is the belief of men today that nothing new can be undertaken in politics or in church or in letters or in trade or in farming or in our social manners and customs, and as it is all but at times the belief of society that the world is used up. But Bonaparte knew better than society, and moreover knew that he knew better. I think all men know better than they do, know that the institutions we so volubly commend are go-karts and baubles, but they dare not trust their presentments. Bonaparte relied on his own sense, and did not care a bean for other people's. The world treated his novelties just as it treats everybody's novelties, made infinite objection, mustered all impediments, but he snapped his finger at their objections. Quote, what creates great difficulty? End quote. He remarks, quote, in the profession of the land commander is a necessity of feeding so many men and animals. If he allows himself to be guarded by the commissaries, he will never stir, and all his experiments, all his expeditions will fail. End quote. An example of his common sense is what he says of the passage of the Alps in winter, which all writers, one repeating after the other, have described as impracticable. Quote, the winter, end quote, says Napoleon, quote, is not the most unfavorable season for the passage of lofty mountains. The snow is infirm, the weather settled, and there's nothing to fear from avalanches. The real and only danger to be apprehended in the Alps. On these high mountains, there are often very fine days in December, of a dry cold with extreme calmness in the air. End quote. Read his account, too, of the way in which battles are gained. Quote, in all battles, a moment occurs when the bravest troops, after having made the greatest effort, feel inclined to run. The terror proceeds from a want of coincidence in their own courage, and it only requires a slight opportunity, a pretense to restore confidence to them. The art is to give rise to the opportunity and to invent the pretense. At Arcola, I won the battle with 25 horsemen. I seized that moment of lassitude, gave every man a trumpet, and gained the day with this handful. You see that two armies are two bodies which meet and endeavor to frighten each other. A moment of panic occurs, and that moment must be turned to advantage. When a man has been present in many actions, he distinguishes that moment without difficulty. It is easy as casting up an addiction. End quote. This deputy of the 19th century added to his gifts a capacity for speculation on general topics. He delighted in running through the range of practical or of literary and abstract questions. His opinion was always original and to the purpose. On the voyage to Egypt, he liked after dinner to fix on 3 or 4 persons to support a proposition, and as many to oppose it. He gave a subject, and the discussions turned on questions of religion, different kinds of government, and the art of war. One day he asked whether the planets were inhabited. On another, what was the age of the world. Then he proposed to consider the probability of the destruction of the globe, either by water or by fire. At another time, the truth of or fallacy of presentiments and the interpretation of dreams. He was very fond of talking of religion. In 1806, he conversed with Fournier, Bishop of Montpellier, on matters of theology. There were 2 points on which they could not agree, viz., that of hell and that of salvation. Out of the pale of the church, the emperor told Josephine that he disputed like a devil on these 2 points, on which the bishop was inexorable. To the philosophers, he readily yielded all that was put against religion as the work of men and time. But he would not hear of materialism. One fine night, on deck, amid a clatter of materialism, Bonaparte pointed to the stars and said, quote, "You may talk as long as you please, gentlemen, but who made all that?" End quote. He delighted in the conversation of men of science, particularly Monge and Berthollet, but the men of letters he slighted. They were, quote, manufacturers of phrases, end quote. Of medicine, too, he was fond of talking, and with those of its practitioners whom he most esteemed, with Corvisart at Paris, and with Anto Amarchi at St. Helena. Quote, "Believe me," end quote, he said to the lass, quote, "we had better leave off all these remedies. Life is a fortress which neither you nor I know anything about. Why throw obstacles in the way of its defense? Its own means are superior to all the apparatus of your laboratories. Corvisart candidly agree with me that all your filthy mixtures are good for nothing. Medicine is a collection of uncertain prescriptions, results of which taken collectively are more fatal than useful to mankind. Water, air, and cleanliness are the chief articles in my pharmacopoeia." End quote. His memoirs dictated to Count Montholm and General Gourgaud at St. Helena have great value after all the deduction that seems to be made from them on account of his known disingenuousness. He had a good nature of strength and consciousness superiority. I admire his simple, clear narrative of his battles. Good as Caesar's, his good nature and sufficiently respectful account of Marshal Wimser and his other antagonists, and his own equality of it as a writer to his varying object. The most agreeable portion of the campaign in Egypt is the campaign in Egypt. He had hours of thought and wisdom, and intervals of leisure, either in the camp and or the palace. Napoleon appears as a man of genius directing on abstract questions the native appetite for truth and the impatience of words he was wont to show in war. He would enjoy every play of invention, a romance, a bon mot, as well as stratagem in a campaign. He delighted to fascinate Josephine and her ladies in a dim lighted apartment by the terrors of a fiction, to which his voice and dramatic power lent every addiction. I call Napoleon the agent of attorney, of the middle class of modern society, of the throng who fill the markets, shops, counting houses, manufactories, ships of the modern world, aiming to be rich. He was the agitator, the destroyer of prescription, the internal improver, the rebel, the liberal, the radical, the inventor of means, the opener of doors and markets, the subverter of monopoly and abuse. Of course, the rich and aristocratic did not like him. England, the center of capital in Rome, and Austria, centers of tradition and genealogy, opposed him. The consternation of the dull and conservative classes, the terror of the foolish old men and old women of the Roman conclave, whom the despair took hold of anything and would cling to red-hot iron. The vain attempts of status to amuse and deceive him, of the Emperor of Austria to bribe him, and the instinct of the young, ardent, and active men everywhere, which pointed him out as the giant of the middle class, make his history bright and commanding. He had the virtues of the masses of his constituents. He had also the vices. I'm sorry that the brilliant picture had its reverse, but that is the fatal quality which we discover in our pursuit of wealth, that it is treacherous and is brought by the weakening of the sentiments. And it is inevitable that we should find the same fact in the history of this champion, who proposed to himself simply a brilliant career without any stipulation or scruple concerning the means. Bonaparte was singularly destitute of generous sentiments, the highest placed individual in the most cultivated age and population of the world. He had not the merit of common truth and honesty. He is unjust to his generals, egotistic and monopolizing, meanly stealing the credit of their great actions from Caliban, from Bernadotte, intriguing to involve his faithful Junot in hopeless bankruptcy in order to drive him to a distance from Paris, because the familiarity of his manners offends the new pride of his throne. He is a boundless liar, the official paper, his quote, monocule, end quote, and all his bulletins of proverbs for saying what he wished to be believed. And worse, he sat in his premature old age in his lonely island, coldly falsifying facts and dates and characters, and giving to history a theatrical eclat. Like all Frenchmen, he has passion for the stage effect. Every action that breathes of generosity is poisoned by his calculation. His star, his love of glory, his doctrine of the immortality of the soul are all French. Quote, I must dazzle and astonish if I were to give the liberty of the press. My power could not last 3 days. End quote. To make a great noise is his favorite design. Quote, a great reputation is great noise. The more there is made, the farther off it is heard. Laws, institutions, monuments, nations will fall, but the noise continues and resounds in after ages. End quote. His doctrine of immortality is simply fame. His theory of influence is not flattering. Quote, there are two levers for moving men, interest and fear. Love is a silly infatuation. Depend on it. Friendship is but a name. I love nobody. I do not even love my brothers. Perhaps Joseph a little from habit, because he is my elder. And Duroc, I love him too. But why? Because his character pleases me. He is stern and resolute, and I believe the fellow never shed a tear. For my part, I know very well I have no true friends. As long as I continue to be what I am, I may have as many pretended friends as I please. Leave sensibly to women. But men should be firm in heart and purpose, or they should have nothing to do with war and government. End quote. He was thoroughly unscrupulous. He would steal, slander, assassinate, drown, and poison as his interests dictated. He had no generosity but mere vulgar hatred. He was intensely selfish. He was perfidious. He cheated at cards. He was a prodigious gossip, and opened letters and delighted in his infamous police, and rubbed his hands with joy when he had intercepted some morsel of intelligence concerning the men and women about him, boasting that, quote, he knew everything, end quote, and interfered with the cutting of the dresses of the women, and listened after the hurrahs and the compliments of the street, incognito. His manners were coarse. He treated women with low familiarity. He had the habit of pulling their ears and pinching their cheeks when he was in good humor, and of pulling the ears and whiskers of men, and of striking in horseplay with them. To his last days, it does not appear that he listened at keyholes, or at least that he was caught at it. In short, when you have penetrated through all the circles of power and splendor, you are not dealing with a gentleman at last, but with an impostor and a rogue, and he fully deserves the epithet of Jupiter, Scapion, or a sort of scamp Jupiter. In describing two parties into which modern society divides itself, the Democrat and the Conservative, I said Bonaparte represents the Democrat, or the party of men of business, against the stationary or conservative party. I omitted them to say what is material to the statement, namely that these two parties differ only as young and old. The Democrat is a young conservative. The conservative is old Democrat. The aristocrat is the Democrat ripe and gone to seed, because both parties stand on the one ground of the supreme value of property, which one endeavors to get, and the other to keep. Bonaparte may be said to represent the whole history of his party, its youth, and its age, yes, and with poetic justice its fate in his own. The counter-revolution, the counter-party, still awaits for its organ and representative, and a lover and a man of truly public and universal aims. I'm going to end here. Very interesting, powerful read about Napoleon. Just finished. Please share your thoughts, your insights, your comments. What do you think about these ideas? What do you think about my style of reading? What do you think about this story with Napoleon? And please subscribe if you haven't already. I want to thank you for listening to me reading. Thank you for taking time out of your busy day, busy schedule, to listen to me reading these amazing insights. Essays written by Ralph Waldo Emerson. Have a beautiful day going forward. Keep on shining a beautiful light. Go much loves. I love you. Take care.